You're listening to the Life Purpose Advisor Podcast, episode 34.
I have been very, very slow on the uptake in the dating world because I really don't want to put my kids through multiple divorces or anything. So, yeah, it's ended up that's caused me to be a single parent for a long time. And it was definitely a journey. I would say that I am probably an incredibly typical father, but my skill set was weak.
You're listening to the Life Purpose Advisor Podcast.
Life purpose, spirituality, higher calling, personal growth, meaningful life.
We ask the deep questions about living a balanced life of meaning, purpose, and joy.
Passion, know thyself, be mindful, spiritual practice, aha moments, life lessons, balance.
It is time to welcome your host, Angie Swartz.
Today, it's my great pleasure to welcome my friend Dave Taylor to the show. Dave is a longtime technology person, a speaker, a writer, a film critic, a single parent, the author of over 20 books, and much, much more. Good to see you today, Dave.
Hi there, Angie. Thanks for having me on your show.
It's my pleasure. Always my pleasure to talk to you. Tell us a little bit about what you have going on these days.
Well, this week's been a particularly busy week for me. I just finished teaching a course that ran 3 weeks on digital marketing, and I've been doing a lot of video production work for various companies, including Dell and Kidde Fire Safety, and what else? And doing my usual writing, and actually went to a film screening a couple of nights ago, so I also have on my to-do list to write up a review of the new film Furious 7. The 7th installment in the Fast and Furious franchise.
Ah, very, very exciting. So a big hodgepodge of things that keep you busy on an ongoing basis, which I'm very interested to get into with you today. One of the main reasons that I wanted you to come on this show was to talk to people about all the different facets of your life and how they fit together. But let's just start with talking about teaching a digital marketing class. Were you doing that online or live?
I do an organization called Boulder Digital Arts, and it's a terrific local resource. I'm based here in Boulder, Colorado, and it's a sort of independent continuing ed, and, you know, it's really tons of really great programs and courses on WordPress design and Photoshop and Final Cut Pro and how to do studio lighting and so on and so forth, and it's a solid class that I teach, and, you know, really I enjoy it a lot because we have 3 weeks, so we have plenty of time to actually learn what each other's business is about, and I can really understand where people are coming from. And, of course, the digital landscape is so fluid that it's always really interesting to try to capture that and actually teach this or share this with other people.
If there were only one thing that you could say to a business owner that's out there struggling with social media, digital marketing, or someone that's even thinking about starting a new business, can you narrow that down to one item that you would recommend that they do?
Sure. I'm going to actually do that by somewhat misquoting a president I really like, John F. Kennedy. And my misquote of him is, ask not what the Internet can do for you, but what you can do for the Internet. And I think that's the one piece of advice I would have for any business person online, which is contribute.
So be out there providing quality content that people can find useful, whether or not they end up doing business with you or not.
Exactly, because you can't sell online anywhere near as easily as you can become trusted, and then people will want to buy from you.
And get to know you. Just get to know you altogether, right?
Right. And, you know, the other thing, I know we're not probably supposed to mention this word in business contexts, but it's actually fun once you realize that you can actually help people out.
I think the listeners of this show would be happy to hear you talking about fun, for sure. So I approve, and I'm glad you brought it up. So you have a few websites, AskDaveTaylor.com and GoFatherhood.com. Can you tell us a little bit about both of those?
Sure. So in that same spirit, AskDaveTaylor.com, which is now in, I think, my 13th or 14th year. I don't know. It's been around a long time. And it's really all about helping people out. I actually seem to have figured out a lot about technology, so I write tutorials. I write how-tos, things that are often really, really narrow and focused, but across a long period of time, they end up covering a lot of subject matter. So I have hundreds of tutorials on how to do very specific things on Facebook, for example. And in the last year or two, I've also gotten a lot into product reviews, and that's actually really fun because I get a nonstop stream of UPS and FedEx boxes as companies are eager to have me touch their products and evaluate them. And I like that I can actually share that with my readers and viewers on YouTube, because I think that for a lot of us, particularly with the sort of ongoing demise of box stores and retail, a lot of times when we're buying, gadgets or electronics, we're really just hoping that it's going to be what the vendor says, and having trusted third parties becomes a hugely beneficial thing, because then I can tell you this isn't the one you want, and you can trust me on that.
Mm-hmm. So if a product gets in your hands that is just pretty crappy, that's what you say.
Yeah, I mean, I'll definitely talk about the pros and cons of anything, and that's because my mom, sort of drummed into me, if you have nothing nice to say, but as a reviewer, you have to sort of find that balance. And I've definitely said this product isn't ready to ship yet. They need one more iteration, and then it'll be really good. And sometimes vendors get very snippy about that, and other times they actually are very appreciative of the feedback, and they'll contact me and say, we're getting back to you in 6 months with the next generation, and we think you'll be amazed. And I'm always appreciative of that because, again, I have the opportunity to do that in a way that regular folk don't, and that's a beneficial thing for everybody.
Mm-hmm. Well, we thank you for that. What is your favorite type of product to review?
Right now I'm on a wearables kick. So, I think it might just be leading up to the Apple Watch, but I have a lot of different smartwatches right now, and actually I have a Microsoft band on my wrist, and that's a great little product, and, it really helps me keep track of what's going on in my digital world without being as in your face as me having to pull my phone out of my pocket all the time.
Mm-hmm. So you can look down. Just tell us briefly how it works.
Yeah, it looks like a fitness band or a little black bracelet, and as things happen on my phone, or in the phone world, little notifications show up on the screen on the Microsoft band, and they're only on there for a second or two. It vibrates, and so I can look if I want to, or I can ignore it, knowing that I can just pick it up later. And that's really nice, so that if my child emails me or texts me saying, I'm sick, can you come get me from school, then my wrist vibrates for long enough that it catches my attention. But if I'm just getting yet another email newsletter from somebody, then that's easily something I can ignore until it's an appropriate moment.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. How long do you think we are away from, I'm not technical like you, but I recently saw a video of a wearable like that projecting the phone onto our skin. Is that something that we're going to see soon?
There's a lot of interesting stuff people are experimenting with. There are already projecting systems. There's projectable keyboards, for example. The problem with that is that it turns out to be really hard to actually interact with them. And outside of science fiction films, a lot of us don't necessarily want that tattoo on the back of our hand to actually be a live computer screen or keyboard. And again, some of us do, and they'll help create the next generation of things, and they'll push the envelope, and some of the things they do will be horrible, and people will just totally reject it, and that's okay. And other things will actually be stepping stones to cooler, more interesting tech that will really help people out. And, you think about all this stuff and it seems like it might be a little creepy, but think about it from an assistive perspective. If I have, for example, a lot of problems with my memory, a pair of glasses that would remind me of the name of someone that's walking towards me could be really, really beneficial.
Oh my, a salesperson's dream.
Yep, especially if floating over their head is like their current annual salary or something.
I'm sure we're headed there. You mentioned the ability to get a message from your child and go pick them up if they need you. Can we just talk about that part of your life a little bit in your gofatherhood.com website?
Yeah, well, that's a huge piece of my life. So, it's funny, this week my children are actually with their mom in Hawaii. So I have this week to just work a ton, which is nice. I'm catching up on things. But in general, my life is probably mostly taking care of my children. I have an 18-year-old daughter, a 15-year-old son, and an 11-year-old daughter. And we're at a sort of interesting moment right now because both of the older ones are doing an online high school. And this is not something that we all collectively ever planned, but it sort of just came out that way. And that's really interesting. It's really interesting to try to run a business and be a sane parent and an actual sane human being and spontaneously end up being like the homeschool superintendent to help remind them to stay on task. And, you know, tying in with all of that, the other big online property that I have is gofatherhood.com. And I don't write necessarily about my experiences as a parent because I think there's a whole privacy piece there that I think is really important, particularly in terms of honoring my children's privacy. But I write instead about parenting, and I write about the challenges that parents face and the sort of new reality that our children face with cyberbullying and always on internet and, you know, the challenge of going to sleep when you might have a little tiny phone tucked under your pillow and at 2 a.m. it vibrates because your friend can't sleep.
Mm-hmm. You've been a longtime proponent of fathers' rights and fathers, maybe that's not the right word, but a bigger part of a father's role in their children's life. You've been doing this by yourself for how long?
Oh, God, I don't know. It was back before I had a head full of gray hair. I've been divorced 7 years, and we had parted ways probably a year prior to that. So it makes me a little sad to think that my 11-year-old, and I've asked her this, she has no memories of her mother and I actually being together. She has no memories of our original family home, but this is her life. And I have been very, very slow on the uptake in the dating world because I really don't want to put my kids through multiple divorces or anything. So, yeah, it's ended up that's caused me to be a single parent for a long time. And it was definitely a journey. I would say that I am probably an incredibly typical father, is always in the right place, but my skill set was weak. And when we first started going our separate ways and I had to take care of my children by myself, I had always been used to tag teaming, where if I was getting really frustrated or I felt like they weren't listening to me or I felt like they were being disrespectful, tag, you're it, you go take care of them. When you're a single parent, that's gone. And so you need to figure the whole thing out. And yeah, truth be told, that first 6 months to a year was not entirely pretty. There were some pretty spectacular bad times. But we all worked it out. And my kids now, at this point, seem, based on their behavior, the option that they have in their life.
Mm-hmm. I'm sure your relationship with them is different because you've been a single parent?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's two big variables there. The first one is that I'm a single parent, but the other one that's just as important is that they have been growing up. So my relationship with my 18-year-old is almost as a peer. Now, I will say that I am extremely cautious to not have us be friends because I don't think that's beneficial for the child. I don't want to be her friend. I want to be her father, and that's a much better role. It's much more exciting, and it's much more exclusive. My ex has remarried, and my kids are very clear that the new man in her life is not their father. It's their stepdad, and, they even come up with different names for him. They call him Steppy and such, which I appreciate because it's just a constant reminder that you're not dad. You're this other guy, and we still love you. You're still part of the sort of big collective family dynamic, but Gabe's our dad, and you're not, and that's okay.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And just talk a little bit more about what you said about your distinction between not wanting to be a friend and wanting to be a father. What's the main difference in those two things in your mind?
I think the biggest difference is that as an adult, I need to have adults as friends. When I'm having a hard day, when I have a client gets upset, or when there's just interpersonal problems with my friends or even with someone I might be seeing, I don't really feel like that's the business of my children, and I don't want to burden them with the sense of maybe having to be responsible for my happiness. And I know all too many older children or even adults now where they talk about their childhood, and once they hit adolescence, their parents treated them as friends, and now these kids had to own things like, is mom happy today? What can I do to make her feel better? And, on the one hand, as human beings, we should all be trying to help each other do better and be happy. But on the other hand, as a child, I don't really want them to think of me as their world. I want them to think of their peers and their life as where they're heading. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much for discussing that. I think that's a really important distinction. And as you know, I have a 10-year-old daughter myself, and and I'm also a single parent. All the things that you're talking about are very important in the role of a parent, and I think sometimes we don't stop to think about those things.
Well, and I just want to sort of add, that's exactly what I do in Go Fatherhood, is I really try to step back and look at what's the bigger picture. I had a piece that I wrote about the interpersonal dynamics between fellow parents. And ironically, I actually had another parent who saw himself in the article and threatened to sue me because he got really, really upset. And so that article is no longer on my site because my goal is not to cause trouble. My goal is not to cause any upset. But, just sort of calling it as I see it, I think that there is a requirement. When you become a parent, you're no longer just an adult doing your thing. You have a whole bigger world within which to play. And as we'll talk about as we go down this interview, I think that it's really a higher calling. And I see that as a parent, this is really my mission. This is really what my life is about, is to create these 3 fabulous little adults as best I can, recognizing that I am not in control of the situation. And that's really where my heart is. All the tech and stuff is fun, and I enjoy everything that I do. I love teaching. I love being on stage and, speaking publicly. But it's really helping my kids become great people that really is what warms my heart.
Beautiful, beautiful. I find the intersection of your personality, the tech person, the father, the movie critic, to be extremely interesting, and it makes you a great person to begin with, but it makes you a very interesting person for the audience that might be listening to this show. Do you know the connection between those 3 things for yourself?
Yeah, I mean, really the commonality across all of this is how people communicate and the storytelling aspect of communication. When I look at things like teaching, to me, teaching is storytelling. And, it's the same with public speaking. And I've advised other people on how to be public speakers. And what I always say is start by being entertaining. Now you have their attention. Now you can convey information. And it's absolutely the same with child raising, with parenting. And really even just with being with your friends is not everyone needs to be the center of attention. Not everyone needs to be full of jokes and puns and humor. But it's that whole idea of how can I help you? How can I relate something that will help you get through your challenges? And we all have problems. We all have challenges. We all have weaknesses. We all have things that we can be better at. And again, part of being a good parent and part of being a good friend is accepting that in your friends and accepting that in your children while trying to convince them to strive to be better people. And, of course, trying to be a better person yourself.
Mm-hmm. I was just going to say accepting that that's true for ourselves as well is a big thing. How many people out there are thinking that they should be more perfect or be living a more perfect life than they are, which serves nobody, really.
Right. And I will say that with 2 teenagers in the house, I'm pretty sure they're convinced that they are perfect. So, so I have a great story about that. So my 15-year-old, he's just got his driver's permit. And he's lucky. His mom has a farm, so he's gotten to drive their truck around on the farm and stuff for, at least 6 months to a year. So he's not coming at this cold, but he got his permit. The same day he and I were out, we were driving around the neighborhood, and he looks at me and he says, I don't get it. Why are you guys all saying that it's hard to drive? This is easy. I mean, let's just go drive to Denver. And I'm like, day one, and you're convinced you're the perfect driver. But that's that sort of fabulous characteristic of youth is, every teenager's immortal, and every teenager's instantly super good at everything. And, I wonder sometimes what it would be like if we could hold on to just a little bit more of that as we get older.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You bring back a memory for me. My my stepfather, taught me how to drive on a stick shift. And it was not the only car in our family, but I think he chose that purposely to teach me the lesson that you're talking about, because I was one of those kids too, as I'm sure you were, where I did not have boundaries as far as success. Things came easily, and I probably thought I was a great driver, or would have thought that I was a great driver had I, had an easy car to start with. Interesting where our lessons show up.
Yeah, and, perhaps the most frustrating part of parenting is when you realize that it's really all about what you do. Parenting would be so much easier if your kids would just listen to what you say and ignore what you do, right? Because then we would all be fabulous parents. But I see with my kids all the time, it's like I really have to be conscious of what I do and how I act and how I interact in front of them. And so things like obscenities, when I'm hanging out particularly with my male friends, obscenities, maybe it's not quite as bad as a longshoreman's convention, but we definitely will drop the F-bomb occasionally as perhaps appropriate. But when my kids are around, I just have to turn on that filter and say, I can use that word once in a blue moon for dramatic effect, but I really can't talk that way in front of even my 15-year-old, because then he's going to do it to me, and it's going to really upset me.
Mm-hmm. So true. So true. You've talked a lot about the difficulties of parenting. Before we move into some questions about you that are more personal, let's just talk about what you think the great joys of parenting are.
I think the greatest joy of parenting is that you start out with this, if you will, malleable piece of clay, and you realize, number one, that these little creatures have personalities and have likes and dislikes and senses of humor and all this, even when they're tiny. My children, even when they were little babies, when they were just starting with their first words, some things would be funny to them and other things wouldn't. And so I think one of the great joys is watching them develop. It's really like a really slow Polaroid photo where you guess and you think you know what they're going to be like and where they're going to go and what road they're going to be on. But, we're along for the ride as parents. And particularly once they hit adolescence, they are going down their own road. And it's really a fascinating, fascinating thing. And one more thing I'll say is that I adored language acquisition. I was not really hugely thrilled with tiny mewling babies. A lot of guys are really great at that, and they love their 1-month-old and stuff. I really, really had a much better time once my kids started to learn how to communicate, and watching how quickly they soak up language and start to speak and then start to make sense and then start to reveal their personality. That was phenomenal. I enjoyed it immensely with all 3 of my children.
Says the storyteller and the writer. No surprise there. So do your children still like you, your adolescents?
Yeah, surprisingly to me, they actually do like me. And part of that might be just because I have that coolness factor of I go to see movies, I meet people from Hollywood, I get gadgets, we have, stuff shows up in the mail all the time. But part of it is also that I really try to extend to them the same thing I do with all of my friends, even though they're not my friends, they're my children, is paying attention. And I think one of the things that we're losing as a culture because of all our digital devices and everything is the ability to put everything down and look someone else in the eye and say, I hear you, now talk to me.
And I love that that's coming from you, Dave. You're kind of a famous guy. You've done a lot of really amazing things in your lifetime, and probably a lot of things that could take you on the road, keep you from being focused with your children. I say that because if you're able to do that, what about the rest of us? We should be able to do that as well. I remember having a conversation with you years ago about your rules, maybe that's not the right word, but your rules for your children seeing movies and watching television. Are you still in that thought process about that with children?
Yeah, actually, my son and I are embroiled in a conversation about whether Breaking Bad is appropriate for a 15-year-old. He says, I'm 15, you really shouldn't even be worrying about what I watch. And I'm like, on the contrary, I also know how it impacts you. So, as a film critic, I see, for example, horror movies, and every so often a studio will send me a DVD, and I'll watch a movie that scares me. And there's some really well-done movies out there. And then I will tell my kids, so this one's not on your list. However, I am totally fine with us watching this film together when you're 25. And then they roll their eyes. But then they don't watch it, so it works out.
Right. And you had a rule with them that they weren't allowed to watch certain things or go into the movie theater when they were younger. Is that right? Am I remembering that correctly?
Yeah, well, I certainly think that what I enjoy about going to a movie is the same thing that is completely overwhelming for a child, which is that it's an immersive, loud experience, and that because it's really dark, it also takes away all of your other senses. So you don't have any, if you will, anchor to hold. So you're in a dark movie theater, and again, I just saw Furious 7, and I saw it in IMAX, and there were scenes that made me dizzy. And, there's some very well-done visual effects, but for a little child, it's really overwhelming. And I still remember years ago, I had a terrible experience with a guy and his little son. And his son, I'm guessing, I don't remember, but maybe the son was around 9 or 10. And the boy was in tears, and he really needed to leave. And it was a completely inappropriate movie for a child that age, but the dad really wanted to see it. So he told the boy to just go stand by the wall. And I just remember that just absolutely ruined the film for me, because it's okay to say, here's a film I need to see when I'm not with my kids. Here's a film I need to see when I pay for a babysitter. Or here's a film I need to wait until it comes out on DVD, and I'll watch it when everyone's asleep. But, what he did, I now reflect back on it, really borders on child abuse.
Right. I see what you're saying. My daughter has always been very stern on the fact that she is not happy in a 3D environment or an IMAX. And, she's pretty vocal about it. It doesn't matter if, she's got to wait a couple hours if the time's not right. But even with her friends, she won't do it for the reason that you're describing for this much younger child. But as I mentioned, she's 10 and she knows what works for her. So.
Yeah, and that's terrific. That's a reflection of good parenting, that you actually honor her voice so she has learned to speak her truth. And that's a really great thing. A whole lot of parents don't have that skill. And so a whole lot of kids have learned to just shut up and cope.
Well, thank you very much for saying that. But she has a pretty strong personal compass and a big voice when she has something important to her in her mind.
And I suspect there's a story behind that comment.
She's just very stern in who she is and what does and doesn't work for her. She's also very sensitive, but the things that, for example, since we're talking about parenting, when she was younger, probably until about age 5, she loved being the center of attention. But now she has some pretty big stage fright. So to the point where over the years she wouldn't do gymnastics recitals, or when there's a chorus concert coming up, which she loves singing, she for years would make herself sick beforehand because she'd get so nervous about that. And, of course, that's not in my DNA. I certainly understand what it feels like to be nervous and to take that nervousness into a performance. But something I had to learn, that she is not me, and I have to be respectful of those things and let her choose.
Right. And at the same time, to give her the ability to grow either beyond that or to learn how to cope with it.
Right. Right. It comes up every couple years. She's growing in those areas some, but it's one of those things I kind of keep the compass on, because it's really, as you stated, it's not up to me at all. It's my job to expose her to new things and let her choose what role she plays in all of them. But that's hard, I think, sometimes for parents, because they have these images of what their children should be doing and what's good for them, or what society thinks is good for them. And if anybody out there is listening and your children are giving you feedback, we both, I think, encourage you to listen to them because they're very smart. They're very smart children, all of them.
Right, and it's really disheartening to have your parents vicariously live through your experiences as a child. And, my sons and my both daughters have been involved in sports, and there's always that one parent who's the coach on the sidelines, and it's awful. And the kids hear all of it, and they process all of it. And I have watched kids who have had really, really good games look like they were ready to commit suicide because they, were looking for just a little ounce of positive feedback from a parent. And the parent, instead of saying, great job on those 7 baskets, will say, how could you have missed that free throw? We need to go home and you need to practice free throws. I'm really disappointed in you.
For sure. And, I spend my days coaching people that are adults, sometimes adults in their 30s, 40s, 50s, that are still reliving things like you just talked about. Their whole life, those things stay with them, and they're the stories that run in their heads that tell them they're not worthy or that they can't make the next decision to go bigger in their life because that's where it starts, at a young age that you're highlighting right there. I'm honored to do that work with folks, but on the other hand, it's frightening sometimes to think about the impact that we do have as parents and really being careful with the language that we use because it's lasting, a long-lasting effect.
Right, and I think that's very true. And just sort of to close this thought is, and us parents are also human, and I talk about that with my kids sometimes too, because one of the things I believe very strongly in is postmortems, not in as much as like analyzing dead people, but like after a fight or an argument, then going back and saying, here's what really pushed me over the edge. What did I do that got you so upset? How can we not do this next time? And sometimes they can't go there, and sometimes they don't have the words, and other times it'll be like, when you say this, it's really upsetting for me. And I then get great data, and I'm like, you know what? I won't say that again, and I appreciate your feedback.
I try really hard to work on that myself, and it makes a big, big difference. Thank you for bringing that up. I still have to work on those things. One of the things, just to kind of wrap our conversation on parenting, one of the things that I remind myself to do every time my daughter gets older is to read a book about what's appropriate for this age, so that I can reset my own compass on, what is a 9-year-old capable of? What is an 8-year-old capable of? Because they are really still little.
Yeah, and it's hard to remember that because I think in our culture, we are over-sexualizing them younger and younger. And so, you go to the mall now and you'll see 12-year-olds with eye makeup and outfits that I feel are rather quite inappropriate for a young girl to be wearing. And they're just parading around, and frankly, their parents might not even know, because it's certainly something that children can do, which is, I'm out and I'm taking my backpack, and as soon as they leave the house, they change outfits.
Why do you think they do that?
Because they're looking for attention, because they want to be adult. It's the same reason kids smoke. And it's interesting, that's gone down a lot. But, it's the idea that, well, if this is what adults do, if I do this, then people will think I'm an adult. This is the Brooke Shields movie that brought her into prominence, where she was like 14 and she was a prostitute in New Orleans. And, that's what that film was all about.
Right. Well, let's hope that both of our children are not parading around the shopping mall wearing scantily clothed outfits. Anything else you want to say about parenting? I would love to ask you some questions about your life purpose in your own life.
Let's just jump into that, because I can talk about parenting forever, because I have combined like 37 years of parenting at this point.
Right. That's a lot of years of parenting, 37 years. Well, just close that. I wanted to ask you about GoFatherhood.com. What kind of person is that site built for? And if they're listening, who should go there and read what you've written about parenthood?
Well, I'd like to think it will appeal to all parents and perhaps grandparents, but a lot of who I'm writing to are fathers. And I talk a lot about the father's experience. And I do feel very strongly, you sort of mentioned this earlier, but I feel strongly that in a divorce situation, the cards are stacked against the father, And having gone through the process myself, I understand and sympathize with men that just can't hold it for long enough and finally just walk away. Or they have visitation rights, which is one night every 2 weeks. And then that feeds itself to the point where then they don't have a relationship with their child. And then they end up walking away completely because, it's really hard for a child to have a relationship with a parent who spends 95% of their time child-free. And so I really try to wrestle with a lot of those topics, and I get a lot of email, and I, interview people and talk with authors of fathering and parenting books, and even go to dad conferences to try to get an understanding of where are we as a culture, and why are we here, and why are, fathers or men so less honored than women are as mothers.
Mm-hmm. I find this topic very interesting myself because my ex-husband and I have a very shared arrangement. My daughter is with both of us half the time. We correspond and talk to each other about what's best for her, and I feel like that works really well for her. But what I experience in our culture is that there's such a bias to how people feel about what it's like to be divorced that they project that on us. For example, people will say to me, "Oh, you're divorced. I'm so sorry. Is the father still around? Is he a nice person? Oh, you have 50-50. Does that work? Is it really like, so that the norm is to think of this relationship that is broken, that really doesn't work. And maybe that's because there are many out there that are like that. But it's an interesting cultural place to be in, I think.
Yeah, and as a culture, what are young boys doing in their play? They're learning how to compete. They're learning how to measure themselves against their peers through sports, through video games, through various different enterprises, whereas girls are being babysitters. Girls are playing with dolls. And what I've found with my children is that this is not a cultural institution as much as I think it's a biological imperative. I mean, when I have given my son the opportunity to play with dolls or something, it's just not interesting. Whereas my girls, particularly when they were younger, they're all about that nurturing thing. And so now you get a couple that's married and they have a child, and the mom's going to be better at parenting than the dad because of that. And, and because culture, dads aren't supposed to cry and all that sort of stuff. And then you break that into two separate households, and the dad's kind of lost without a clue, and there's no resources because men generally don't share their challenges with each other. And if they did, it would be in passing while watching a basketball game. Whereas women, you women are way better at this. So if you're having a hard time with your kid, you call up 3 or 4 of your girlfriends and get lots of great advice. And I think that that's a really hard thing to overcome. And it might be that we're fighting against a biological or, trying to swim up a biological stream or something. But I think that dads are extremely capable of being excellent parents. But I think sometimes we might need to cut them some slack so that they can learn how to do that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, Dave, I can't imagine that you're not an equally good parent as your ex-wife. Over the years, I've seen you working through this, and it's a very impressive thing. So let's talk about you a little bit. Do you know what your own life purpose is?
Well, I knew we'd get to this question. And
it is Life Purpose Advisor.
Yeah. I'm pretty sure that my life's purpose is to help. Not just to help sort of people at large, but to help my children grow up to be great adults. And, like anyone who's in the help or coaching or teaching field, I can only create a really nice trough of water and keep my fingers crossed that the horse will drink. And I feel like that's a lot of what I do. When I look at all the different things I'm involved with, it's really trying to help increase the sort of net level of happiness in the world, whether it's within my household, and goodness knows there are times that needs to be increased, or just overall across the internet or my community or across the world.
How long do you think that you've known that? And do you think there were signs along the way as you were growing into your adulthood that pointed you in that direction?
I think really having my first child was a very epiphanous event for me. And prior to that, I would say that I was probably pretty self-absorbed. And honestly, I don't know how my ex-wife actually put up with me, but that's a whole nother story. And I was just sort of, going down that road by putting one foot in front of the other without really having any really big plans. And once I had a child, there was just sort of an internal shift because all of a sudden it became quite apparent that I couldn't just be responsible for me. I now needed to be responsible for another life, which meant I needed to step out of myself and really start looking at the world around me. And I think that's really number one, when I had this, like I said, just sort of epiphanous moment where my life suddenly was like, oh, this is what this is all about. And it really helped me crystallize a lot of what I was spending my time and efforts on.
And how old were you then, if I might ask?
Let me do the math. About 33.
So up until age 33, you were self-absorbed with what?
Probably with looking for the next laugh, with looking for the next good time. I mean, I wasn't into drugs. I wasn't into alcohol. I wasn't someone who hung out at a bar. But it was, let's do cool things and have fun. And I still am definitely motivated by having fun. I don't want to sound all serious or anything. But at the same time, now it's within a context. And now it's a prioritization issue where, if I'm having fun with my friends and my kid needs me, I'm probably going to have to leave my friends and go and take care of my child. And I am totally okay with that because that's my life. And I'm totally cool with that.
Right. So before age 33, did you have any major life events that came along that were formative for you?
Well, I mean, in a positive way. So when I was in high school and college, I always dreamed of working at a research lab for a big corporation. And by the time I was, 18 months out of my undergraduate study, I was working as a research scientist at HP Labs, which is part of Hewlett-Packard. And that was sort of an interesting moment because I was surrounded by absolutely brilliant people, and it was a phenomenally good time. And, it was really an intellectual rush to be around really smart people. And at the same time, there I was, and I was in my early 20s, and I had attained my life goal. And so I also went through a period of sort of soul searching. It's like, well, what's my next goal? What am I going to do from here? And I think that I was sort of in a holding pattern for a number of years until I, started to see the woman who would become my wife. And then we were living in the San Francisco Bay Area, and she wanted to go to grad school. And so she identified Purdue University as her best choice. So I quit my job, and I also went to Purdue and got a master's degree in education. And again, that whole journey of making that decision to leave my friends and leave the job that I had and knew and liked to just go into this new adventure was a big one. And, I absolutely don't regret it. And whatever water has passed between my ex and I, that's not quite the right phrase, whatever water has gone under the bridge between the two of us, we have 3 fabulous children. And, people always ask questions like, if you could go back in time and change one thing. And for me, the answer is I wouldn't change anything because while where I am at right now isn't perfect, it's not too bad.
Life is a beautiful thing if we can see it.
I'd like to think so.
Well, I think so. So I'll believe that for both of us if I need to. So after going for your master's degree, did you go back to HP Labs or a similar position, or you did something different?
Well, at that point, it was interesting because while I was working on my master's, I wrote a book for Macmillan, and I did a lot of magazine articles. And I had already been published in magazines. And one of the articles for a magazine called Internet World spun off, and I ended up running a little business called the Internet Mall, which was an online shopping directory. And when we were done with grad school, we moved back to Silicon Valley, to the Bay Area. And I actually went into a company and said, you guys are hosting my little website. Do you want to buy it off me? Because I don't know what I'm going to do, but I'm not so motivated about this. And the guy who was the head of marketing for this company actually sat down and we, closed the door and said, actually, I'd like to help you make that a new business. And so we actually raised $1 million in venture capital and hired people and had a good run of it. And that was, my first sort of experience with running my own little empire and building my own little business. And that's a pretty nice thing to do. And I have really basically done that ever since. I've had very little time working for the man and a whole lot of time working for me.
Mm-hmm. And how old were you then?
You're really trying to nail all this down, aren't you?
I think for people out there that are listening, it might be an important fact.
Right. So there I was right around in my 30s. And in fact, the funny thing is, for the Internet Mall, the day that we actually signed the incorporation papers, and then we went out for a celebratory dinner, there were 3 of us founders and our partners or spouses. Talk about worst case scenarios. So there I am birthing a company, and we're birthing my first child. So that was
no coincidence there, I'm sure.
Yep.
And you're still running a business and parenting.
Yeah, I can't get away from it.
Talk to me about your spiritual religious beliefs.
So I was raised Jewish, and my family, we weren't very Jewish, and this is, I think, pretty common in Judaism. So we would go to temple for Passover, and I had a bar mitzvah and everything. But the religion never really spoke to me, and I believe that there is a God. I believe that there is more to this than just complete random chance. But at the same time, while I feel spiritual, I don't really like religion. And it's really hard to be a student of history, for example, and not recognize how much religion has damaged and hurt and killed and just, hugely affected our culture, civilization, and just humanity in general. And of course, now we're staring it in the face again with sort of the Christians versus the Muslims, which, maybe it's never quite portrayed that way, but this is really a big issue that's come up in our times and really wasn't an issue 20, 30, 50 years ago.
So do you have, we could spend the rest of our time talking about that, but I'm going to move past it just to stay focused on you. Do you have a spiritual practice?
Not as such. I will say that I like to get outdoors, and I do find that exercise is a somewhat meditative process for me, where I generally shut everything else out and just sort of look inward. But in terms of like morning prayers or meditation or anything like that, I don't have an explicit practice that I do. But again, as I said, I don't feel disconnected from the, if you will, greater world around me.
Mm-hmm. What about coffee?
Well, if coffee is a god, then I definitely worship at that altar.
I know that you spend a lot of time writing in coffee shops on the beautiful mall there in Boulder. Would you consider that part of your practice?
Well, I guess it depends on what you call a practice. To me, that's just part of my lifestyle and part of what I enjoy. I definitely have my favorite coffee shops, and I have, people who work there who we're friends, and we, get together and do stuff. And one of the coffee shops I hang out here in Boulder, they're really into European sports. And so one of the guys who's one of the, I guess, co-managers, we actually scheduled time to watch football matches together. Now, when I say football, I mean English soccer. But I know what team he supports. He knows what team I support. And particularly when those two teams are playing, we'll schedule a time to get together and have a cup of coffee and watch the game together. So is that a spiritual practice? I don't know. But, I think that it is definitely, the coffee house serves the purpose in my life of being a meeting place, in the way that if we were in England, I probably would be hanging out at the pub. Right.
Let me ask you this question slightly differently, with a different meaning. When your life has a lot of moving parts to it, when you get to a place, or if you get to a place of feeling out of balance or overwhelmed, what do you turn to?
Sleep. And that's usually because when my life gets really out of balance, it's because I've actually been robbing from my sleep bucket. And, when I have to stay up till 12 or 1 and then have to get up at 6 a.m. or something, then I know that eventually has a cost in my happiness and my mood. And I also tap my friends. And I find that I have a circle of really excellent friends. And, some of them definitely I can just say, I'm going crazy here. Can we just go and grab a cup of coffee tonight? Are you available for an hour? And, people are available. And of course, I return the favor when they need someone to talk to. As I did last night, I sat with a friend and we talked for a couple of hours about everything that was going on in her life.
Okay. Thank you for that. Over the years, have you ever used any tools to help you know and understand yourself better?
Well, I mean, when I went through my divorce, I went to a therapist every week for about a year and a half. And that was part of my journey to understand who I was. And then I joined a men's group, and that was also part of my journey. And at various times I have, I'm comfortable and happy doing that sort of thing if I feel like I'm stuck. But from a, if you will, religious perspective, I certainly don't have any religious figures or anyone with any wisdom in that area that I would sit down and say, hey, Rabbi, can we go get a cup of tea? Or, Father, can we sit in a pew and talk about the world?
Mm-hmm. I don't think that's always necessary. I mean, particularly based on what you said about taking a break, calling a friend, I think we shouldn't understate the importance of the mentors that are around us every day out there for us to reach out and take advantage of.
Yeah,
because a rabbi or a minister is just another person. They might have some different training, but they're human as well.
Right. It's just like parenting. Parenting happens between things, not during things. And I think that real friendship is, the two of you walking from the car to Starbucks, and then you both stand in front of a display at a store and just, trade a couple of thoughtful comments. I mean, that's, to me, a lot of where all this happens. And I think that the more we try to formalize this and say, well, I sit down and meditate for an hour a day, my guess is that most people have more insights when they're not meditating than when they are. In the same way that when my children are having a hard time, or if we're in a fight or something, I'll pull out a deck of cards and say, hey, do you want to just play some rummy? You want to play some cribbage? Should we play some poker? Because I know that getting out of your energy space and doing anything different is a distraction that lets you then look at where you were instead of being stuck in that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You're a pretty evolved person, I think. I think that people out there that might need meditation in their life, or they're just putting a practice together, they might be they're at a different place on their journey, perhaps, or a different belief system. So yeah, I'm not sure about that.
Yeah, and I don't mean to belittle that. I mean, I'm sure that different people, different things work. And in terms of evolved, I have no pinkies, right?
And quite the sense of humor always that comes with Dave Taylor. You got to love that. I do love that about you. What do you think about the physical body, since you brought up pinkies? Do you think our physical body plays a role in staying on track and in igniting our purpose?
I think that our physical body is not designed for how we use it in the modern world. And I think that we are either going to need to evolve to be in a sort of different form that will be perfect for sitting and typing for 10 hours a day, or we're going to have to really rethink how we do work and how we play so that we can continue to be happy and healthy throughout the long course and increasingly long course of our lives.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you. How about synchronicity? Do you think synchronicity plays a role in your life?
Absolutely. Kismet is how I like to think of that, where it's just this sort of almost random happen chance that turns out to be a really good thing. This is sort of the classic, there I was in the bookstore and I looked up and there you were. And I went over to talk and now we're married. And I think life is full of that. And sometimes we don't even notice it. But yeah, absolutely. I think that, that's part of the wonder, part of the fabulousness of being alive is having these sort of experiences.
Mm-hmm. I'll tell you, I look forward to talking to you the day after that happens to you in the bookstore and that you are once again happily married. I can't wait to talk to you about that day.
My concern is we don't really have bookstores anymore.
Well, as you noted earlier, we have coffee shops and many other places where people are at, and on conferences, which I know that you're a big attendee of. So we never know where these things are coming from. Can I ask you about money?
Yeah, what would you like to know?
Have you ever had an issue with money? Do you feel like that you have everything that you need and want?
Well, I think need and want are very different. I will say that I feel blessed that I have always been able to have a roof over my head, and I've always been able to pay for the groceries at the store. And further than that, there have been times when I have been very flush and things have been very lucrative, and there have been other times when things have been tight, not to have that define my happiness.
I like that.
And I am also fairly thrifty with things, so if you were to say, here's a check for $50,000, I would say thank you and put it in the bank. I wouldn't then go out and buy a car or go buy the latest, 60-inch HD TV or anything like that, because I feel like I have nice stuff. And
because people give them to you already.
Well, that doesn't hurt. But even without that, I would like to think that while perhaps I'm part of the machine that creates this, sort of being candid, I don't feel like I always need to get the next newest, biggest thing. And that's one of the things I try to talk about when I review products is, if you have the iPhone 5, do you really need to upgrade to the iPhone 6? Not really, because there's not a whole lot that's being improved. If you can figure out how to do it so that you get the advantage of the bigger screen without having to pay $700, but ask yourself, is it worth that much money?
Right. I believe in that for sure. I can tell you for sure I upgraded my iPhone 4 to a 6 when the 6 came out. Huge difference, but it was time. Definitely time for that. I would love to ask you a short lightning round of questions.
Go.
Yes, no, short answer, please. Do you think passion and purpose are the same things?
I do not.
Do you think everybody has a life purpose?
I do not.
On a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being high, how important is following your joy and igniting your life purpose?
10.
We know that you did this, but I'll ask you again. Did you ever quit your job to follow your purpose? And do you think somebody needs to quit?
Yes and no.
What brings you great, great joy?
My children, my friends, and my family.
If you unexpectedly amassed a good-sized fortune, what would you do differently?
Very, very little. I would be more philanthropic, however.
Nice. So just in closing, is there anything that we haven't talked about, Dave, that you'd like to cover today?
No, I just appreciate the chance to actually have a conversation about more than how many megabytes of RAM does this device have, because that seems to be much of what my life is about on particular days.
Well, I can almost promise you that I'm never going to ask you that in an interview. I will ask you one more question, and my pleasure. Thank you, Dave. What should listeners learn from your life?
What I'd like to have people learn from my life is that if you can start to try to figure out what's the commonality across all of the things you're interested in, that can really illuminate your future path and can really lead you to being a happier, more productive person, and certainly a better parent and a better friend.
Very rich and very nice. Tell us one more time, what's the best way for people to connect with you?
Oh, there's innumerable ways to connect with me. Probably one of the easiest is I'm Dave Taylor on Twitter, but you can also visit my Go Fatherhood website or my Ask Dave Taylor website. And I certainly get plenty of email from those, but I would be happy to hear from you. And if I can help you, let me know.
Thank you. I have to ask you before we end, I know you just co-authored a new book, Twitter Power 3.0 with Joel Comm. What should we know about Twitter in the modern age?
It's still really important, and it's still a great place for conversations. And most importantly, it's a great place to interact with your clients, your customers, and your community.
Thank you for that. I would love for you, Dave, to offer something special to our listeners. Can I talk you into something?
Sure, talk me into something.
Some preferential treatment, something special for the Life Purpose Advisor listeners?
Okay, well, what I will say is that if you do shoot me a question with some tech support or a question about parenting or something, please do identify yourself as someone who has not just listened to this, but listened all the way through to this point, which is quite an accomplishment. So let me know, and I will prioritize your questions and try to answer them as quickly and as helpfully as I can.
Well, thank you, Dave. Thank you very much. It's very generous. It's been my pleasure talking to you today. I look forward to seeing where your journey continues.
And it's always a pleasure to talk to you, Angie.
We'll see you next time here on the Life Purpose Advisor podcast.
This is Angie Swartz, and I just wanted to commend you for spending some time with us today thinking about the deep topics of life. We know your time is valuable. I really enjoyed our rich conversation today, and I hope you did too. I hope that you're inspired to work on your own personal growth. If there's any way we can help you, please visit us at www.lifepurposeadvisor.com. I'll see you next time.